Howdy friendos, my name is Stuart, and welcome to the worst D&D channel on YouTube, where I do absolutely everything in my power to not talk about D&D. If you want a long-running, high-quality, amazing, long-form Pokemon D&D campaign, you absolutely should subscribe. If you want funny D&D stories from my personal life or from Reddit, subscribe. If you want insightful looks into pop culture characters and see where they exist on the D&D alignment chart, subscribe. If you want to talk about Dungeons & Dragons in a game mechanic and highly informative manner, you might want to head over to my compatriots channel.
Howdy, how's it going? My name's Davvy Chappy, and today we'll be looking at how to create a religion that fits your setting in fun and interesting ways.
First of all, we need to determine what makes religion different in our real world and what makes it different in a fantasy world. Before we begin discussing this, however, I would like to make a disclaimer that this video is not meant to be disrespectful to any religion or any individual set in the real world. I personally grew up into a household that held religion in a very high regard, and while I personally do not view religion as a particularly high priority in my life anymore, this video is not meant to be an attack on any one religion. We will, however, be pointing out several flaws and inconsistencies within real-world religions that will help us create our own religion in our fantasy world.
The big difference between our fantasy world and our own reality is the fact that magic does indeed exist in most D&D settings, but depending on what rules we establish within our own universe, the magic has different sources. You see, in most D&D settings, magic is typically divided into two sources, arcane and divine. Mages, like wizards and sorcerers, use arcane magic, while clerics and paladins, and other classes that worship gods and deities and the natural world, use divine. In D&D, arcane magic is a source of magic that comes from the Weave, a source of raw magic typically managed by some deity of magic. And while the Weave is important for the casting of arcane magic in particular, that's a discussion for another day. If you're creating a religion for your own game, you're going to want a few things. A god or a higher power, a bunch of worshippers, and a culture and relationship between those two parties. Now, what's interesting about a religion in a fantasy setting is, well, worshippers within a fantasy setting have actual physical proof that something is happening that makes the relationship and the religion real. They say a prayer, some magic comes out, and then they can verify that something supernatural has occurred because magic came out. On top of this, the people within a fantasy setting can consistently repeat these experiments. Because of this, it's easy to say that religion is much more important in fantasy settings than it would be within our modern world. In the modern age, there are many reasons as to why someone might find faith. It could be from a near-death experience, family tradition, a desire to understand their place in the universe, community, economics, any number of things.
Personally, while growing up, I based much of my belief in Pascal's wager, a logical and statistical argument that a rational person should believe in God. The basic idea being that it is logical to believe in God just in case there is an afterlife. Here's the basic decision matrix. There are only two possibilities for the divine and two possibilities for yourself. If God exists and you are a believer, you have everything to gain and everything to lose. If God does not exist, there is very little gained or loss. If you are wagering on this with any sort of financial benefit, it is absolutely logical to believe in God at the risk of an eternal punishment. Because if in the chance God doesn't exist, you don't really suffer that much. In a fantasy setting, it is much less likely that there'll be too many atheists because there is, without a doubt, evidence to support a higher power. And this is regardless of your type of setting. In a low or high power setting campaign, magic is still a thing that occurs because of supernatural elements. So when creating a fantasy world, you need to ask yourself the following questions. What sort of religions are available in my world? Are they monotheistic like Christianity? Are they polytheistic like Greek mythology? Are they spiritual or more philosophical like Buddhism? 2. Why would anyone follow a particular religion? What does this religion fulfill? Do they need to follow a religion for salvation? What sort of structure does your religion have? Is it organized, nomadic, monastic? What does your religion feel about other religions? Do they have an intolerant dogma? Do they have tolerance? Do they have acceptance? What about integration? All of these factors come into play when deciding what to create your religion in your fantasy world. So now that we have established this fantasy setting, we need to establish how the gods and deities work within your setting.
In our real world, we have lots of religions to draw from. In fact, over the course of human history, we have had roughly over 4,200 religions, many of them with their own creation myth and cosmology. For the examples of this video, we'll be using Greek mythology, since most people who stumble on this video will be able to follow along, even with a very passive understanding of the mythos. In Greek mythology, there existed the Titans, the giants, and the primordial gods that created the heavens and the earth. Their children are the gods that we know and love from the Disney movies, Zeus and his siblings, and after them are the rest of the Greek pantheon, with their own talents, agendas, and responsibilities. Behind them are the demigods and the great heroes, like Hercules. Within the Greek pantheon, each god had their own duties and goals that they had to follow in order to keep the cosmos running smoothly. Some gods, like Hephaestus, were armors to the gods and were meant to help maintain the power of the gods and make sure that they were always ready for conflict. Other gods, like Poseidon, were meant to manage the seas and oceans for both mortal and god alike. However, he was given a great deal of leeway into how he wanted to do so. Poseidon in particular was a wrathful and angry god, known to hold long grudges and make mortal lives miserable just because he could. In the Odyssey, Poseidon made the war hero Odysseus lost lost at sea for over 10 years, granted 1 year of that was because he was banging Circe, but hey, who's counting? And certain gods like Aphrodite were more vague and meant to be rough representations of concepts like beauty, pleasure, and passion. Worshipping her didn't necessarily grant additional favors in those areas, but it did sometimes help. But more often, you might just accidentally spur her jealousy. There were often times where many problems were caused by Aphrodite herself because her beauty was called into question by various people, like when Mira's mother bragged that her daughter was more powerful than the goddess. Sometimes it's just better to not address those sorts of gods at all.
Either way, this is a fully constructed cosmology full of history and hierarchy of these gods. The myth of the Greeks tells the full story from the beginning of time to their modern day, and even a possible prophecy to the end of the world and the reawakening of Gaia. In fact, most religions and mythologies have some sort of Armageddon prediction. In Norse mythology, they actually had an end of the world called Ragnarok, which predicted the end of their known universe, their gods and man alike. In Aztec mythology, the world had already ended a few times in events called... I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, but it basically translates to 5 suns. The cosmology of these various mythos all had very similar components. There are multiple gods, demigods, titans, monsters, and other entities that exist within their universe. They are each distinct from each other and have complex histories that expand throughout their respective universes.
When constructing a pantheon for your own settings, in either a D&D or any sort of fictional setting, you'll need to balance many things. Who are the characters in your pantheon? What are their powers and their power levels? Where do they get their powers? What do they represent? What are their roles within the mythos? Are they just hanging out, or do they actually have responsibilities? What are their relationships to each other? Do they all get along? Do they intermingle? Do they have romantic entanglements? What are their feelings on mortals? Do they need mortals to worship them? Do they detest opposing worshippers? How do they show their love and support in return? Answering these questions will lead you onto the next step, which is the mortal interpretations of your pantheon.
As mentioned earlier, Greek mythology is a fully constructed cosmology, and it works well within Greek society. We all know these stories today because we have taken great care to gather thousands of historical documents, legends, and stories together and slap them into a comprehensive list. However, people and mortals are messy. We as a modern species only know all of these stories because we have had literal thousands of years to conglomerate stories and to create a concrete narrative. However, this wasn't always the case in a pre-internet world. In fact, the best information delivery system we had was a dude on a horse, or whatever mount or vehicle your world decides to have.
Have you ever watched cheesy 90s movies and thought, man, if they just picked up their phones, all this could have been solved? Well, yeah, information is fleeting and very difficult to spread over great distances. Plus, in the classic game of telephone, information gets muddled and jumbled the more filters, and in this case people, it goes through.
So when you have your cosmos, pantheon of gods, or whatever, you'll need to decide how their worshippers interpret that information. Here are the questions you should ask yourself when you are writing the followers of your religion.
How have the followers gotten this information about the cosmos? Was it given to them by the gods themselves? Did they interpret it from oracles and dreams? Did they find this information pre-written somewhere? Did a prophet spread this information themselves? How accurate are the worshippers' interpretations? Do they have a full picturesque view? Large strokes versus small details? Did they completely miss the mark?
How do the worshippers present information to their followers? Do they hold mass, print books, do missionary work?
Most great fantasy settings have their mortals and worshippers get some things wrong, or at least have multiple different sects of their religion. Just like in real life, there are no 2 religious groups that believe the exact same thing, and even bringing it down to a personal level, most people pick and choose what aspects of their faith they choose to follow. This is where a great deal of your interpersonal drama and story should come from if you ever choose to create stories that focus on the religious aspects of your world. Please do keep in mind that the world is not just made up of good and bad people. A person can do extremely bad things sometimes if they feel pushed to it, or a bad person can do good if they feel compelled. Every person is the hero of their own story, and this completely applies to both gods and their followers.
And this is only scratching the surface of what you need in order to create a religion or fantasy setting. I originally wrote this video for a D&D style setting, but decided to expand it into a very general fantasy style video for the sake of getting it to as many people as possible. I haven't even talked about alignments or any sort of thing that might be useful to a writer. If you want to see a video where I talk about religion, magic, or alignment, check out my alignment video on Rey and Kylo Ren. I do touch base and reiterate a lot of what I discussed here.
And hey, maybe check me out on my channel where I can learn you some knowledge about the greater D&D multiverse. But yeah, Davvy out.